The US-China trade war reshaped global trade, with billions of dollars in tariffs imposed on goods ranging from soybeans to electronics. These policies aim to protect domestic industries and address trade imbalances, but they also disrupted markets, raised prices, and sparked retaliation. In this video, we'll unpack the economic impacts of the trade war, using supply and demand to analyze how tariffs affected businesses, consumers, and global supply chains.
I want to start off with a little bit of background of why we ever got into a trade war with China. The big reason was the bilateral trade deficit. Okay, so a bilateral trade deficit is going to be the difference between imports and exports that the United States has with a single country, right? So it's going to take our imports from China, subtract out our exports to China, okay? And so what I have on this graph, all the way back to 1985, in the blue line, this is going to be the imports from China to the United States. And in the light teal line is going to be the exports to China. And so we can see by 2018-ish, we were importing 452 billion in goods from China every year and exporting only 106 billion. Right? So that gap is going to be a trade deficit. Right? It's going to be a bilateral trade deficit because it's with two countries, right? US-China trade deficit. And so this is growing over time for lots of interesting reasons. And then some politicians are getting concerned, and many economists are getting concerned. Some economists are getting concerned that this is bad, right? This isn't good. China's taking advantage of the United States, and we should do something about it. That's going to lead to the start of this U.S. and China trade war. So before I get onto that, many economists are not worried about a bilateral trade deficit. I'm going to give you the reason why. So China is getting a bunch of dollars for selling all these goods in the United States, and they're not buying and spending all those U.S. dollars back in the United States. So what is China going to do with all those U.S. dollars it has from selling all these goods? Right? They can't buy stuff in China with it, right? China doesn't use dollars. Right? They're not buying it from the United States, so they got to go buy goods from somewhere. And so what they're doing with all this extra, the U.S. dollars they get, are two things. First thing, China buying from, let's say, Germany, right, or Australia. So Germany and Australia are sending a lot of goods to China, where China's using these dollars that they made on the U.S. market to go buy those goods. And then Germany and Australia use those dollars that they got from China to go buy stuff from the United States, changing the trade balance with the United States for Australia, U.S., and Germany, U.S. So what I'm trying to get at here is, like, you don't really care. An individual country like the U.S. doesn't care about a bilateral trade deficit with China. What you might care about is like the overall trade deficit with the entire rest of the world. Right? And if that's big, then you might have concerns. Right? But an individual bilateral country-country trade deficit we don't care about, because all these dollars are moving to other countries, and then Germany might be buying a bunch from the United States. And so maybe this isn't a problem. The second thing China's doing with all its dollars is it's investing dollars back in the United States. And then primarily, they are purchasing U.S. Federal government debt. All right? And so what that means is when they do that, we're not a macroeconomics class. We don't want to spend too much time on it. But what that means is when China takes all their dollars they get from selling goods to the U.S. and they buy federal government debt, that's going to drive down interest rates. So this will drive down interest rates. So an interest rate is what you're going to have to pay to borrow money to buy a car, to buy a house, to buy other things for an individual company to go out and get debt, get a loan to go expand their business. And so when China does this, it's keeping all these things cheap for United States citizens to do that. And so in a sense, many economists are not necessarily worried about this bilateral trade deficit because of these two reasons. But the trade war was pretty. Some people do care about this bilateral trade deficit, and they wanted to affect change on it. Okay. All right. So then we had it was the first presidential administration to start this trade war was going to be the first Trump administration, and they want to we're going to impose tariffs on China, amongst other places in the rest of the world as well, but we're going to focus on China here. And so the blue line is going to be U.S. tariffs on China, and so this solid line is on China, the dashed line is on the rest of the world. And so you see in January 2018, tariffs are about here, where they've been for a long time, about 3% on average, and they start getting ratcheted up. And so this is when a trade war starts, ratchet up to 7%. China responds back, and it retaliates. That's kind of what happens in a trade war. Well, China we're going to put tariffs on your whiskey. We're going to put tariffs on your corn. All these products that China imports from the U.S., from farmers and other producers, we're going to start ratcheting up tariffs on them. And then the U.S. responds back and ratchets up higher. China responds higher. And we try to talk for a while. Oh, we're going to do another round of ratcheting up. Tariffs get really, really high, like 20% for both countries. Right? Think back to the effects of tariffs. You raise tariffs on something, it raises goods for consumers. So these U.S. tariffs raise the price of goods to U.S. consumers. The Chinese tariffs raise the price of goods to Chinese consumers. It also reduces employment in the United States, these Chinese tariffs, for farmers and whiskey producers, etc. Right? And then there's an agreement, and we're going to settle down for a while, but they've pretty much stayed constant here. And Biden administration's in here, and they're going to keep pretty much unchanged from the very end of the Trump administration, and they're still going on to today, January 2025. And so we'll see what happens in the future, or I can get a graph that goes even further and see what happens with these tariffs. Right. So I wanted to give you a little bit more concrete example of how it might affect your pocketbook, these tariffs. One effect on U.S. consumers is going to be higher prices, and these are going to be for washing machines. Lots of washing machines are produced in China, and I want to produce a number on like how much it actually costs an average consumer who's going out to buy a washing machine, placing these tariffs on washing machines. So this graph is a major appliance price index, and so what we want to see here is that over many years leading up to the trade war, the average price of major appliances was declining pretty rapidly. Okay, roughly about a 30% price decline. You can see there. And then around the trade war, these average prices started to shoot up. Okay, so the argument is like, well, if we see prices increasing after the trade war, maybe they were caused by something else. And this graph is to try to convince you, well, they were going down, and right around the time of the trade war, prices started going up again. Okay. All right, so we can see the effects of tariffs. Maybe it's just something in general, like all appliances and not the tariffs. And so we're going to split out washers and dryers. They had tariffs placed on them. Refrigerators and dishwashers did not. I don't know why, some weird technical reason, but refrigerators and dishwashers didn't have tariffs applied to them. What we see for washers and dryers is we see roughly 11 to 12% increase in prices to prior to when the tariffs were imposed. These were the goods that had a tariff imposed on them. These goods, they actually saw price declines. So the idea would, in the absence of the tariffs, washers and dryers would have faced these decline in prices instead. Right? That's kind of what this graph is trying to imply. Big increases in prices for washers and dryers, about 12%. All right, so the effect on U.S. consumers just from these washing machines. Economists did some work here. They estimated that these tariffs raised the price of a washer by $86 on average and a dryer by $92 on average. So I was in the market of buying one of these things at the time, and I knew what was going on, and like I was really pissed about this because like I don't want to pay an extra $200 out of my pocket for these tariffs. They're not helping me out any from this, and so I knew that prices are going to increase for these consumer goods, and consumers are going to be made less well off because of these tariffs. Right. So the domestic producers raise their prices when their foreign competitors are forced to raise their prices due to higher tariffs. We've gone through this, so it's not only the price of foreign-produced washers and dryers, it's actually the price of domestic-produced washers and dryers go up as well. You might argue that, well, we actually got some tariff revenue for the government, so that was good. Well, the revenue from the tariff could have offset the ultimate cost of the price increases, in theory, but the particulars of this case don't show that happening. So in 2018, the tariff revenue brought in on these appliances was roughly $82 million. and that was dwarfed by the estimated 1.5 billion annual cost to consumers. Right, an order of magnitude of 10 for that. And so the cost of these tariffs on consumers drastically outweighs the tariff revenue generated for the government from them.